Mordecai is an author of It Was, It Was Not, Essays in Art on the War Against Iraq, and other publications. He is a radio broadcaster on Vancouver Cooperative Radio, and that's at 102.7 FM, if anyone is in that neck of the woods. And a founding member of Canada-Palestine Support Network called CanPalNet. And I just wanted to read the quote that was on our poster, and I thought that it would probably be a good place to segue into Mordecai's speech. And this is a quote from him. There are hidden loves, forbidden fruits, and suppressed discussions. It is time for open discussion on whether or not it is reasonable to organize a boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign against Israel.
I'd like to say there are two initial points of reference for this discussion, almost any discussion on the question of Palestine. One is that there is an enormous gap between the lived realities of Palestine and the images and reports and opinions we are bombarded with in the media, by government officials, and by most self-defined experts, usually academics. Between the latter and the reality is a huge gap. And it is incumbent in our discussion to make some effort to bridge that gap, to bring reality closer to what we talk about and what decisions we take of action in relation to that reality. The Israeli government has just launched a new campaign which is an attempt to make the distance between discussion and reality even greater. In Toronto this week, they are initiating, as the first place in the world they're initiating this campaign, something they call Brand Israel. They feel that Israel, in the minds of Jewish Canadians, in the minds of Canadians at large, is too closely associated with conflict, and that it would be more advantageous for those who support the policies of the Israeli government that we associate, that people such as ourselves associate Israel with peaceable, refined indulgences, I will say. So, for example, they would like us to think of Israel as a place that produces fine wines, a place that creates interesting and attractive music, a place known for its theatrical productions, but not conflict. The strangeness of this Brand Israel propaganda effort is that the Israelis are saying it's not necessary to have peace in order to appreciate these fine things. Peace is not essential. It's rather if you can live in a security bubble that you are not watching or paying any attention to what's going on around that bubble. And in the bubble you're drinking tea and talking about books and indulging in listening to music. This is what they wish you to appreciate of Israel. Israel is too closely associated with conflict, too closely associated with Palestinians. So let's just pretend it doesn't exist. And let's just think of Israel as have another glass of this very fine wine. The second thing that I think it's important to keep in mind when we discuss Palestine is to be able to sustain an undeniable tension between pain and hope. The reality is extremely grim. The suffering of people is extremely intense. And the power of those who are inflicting that pain and suffering is very great. And so often we forget that there's any possibility of hope and any possibility of intervening in a productive fashion. In the organization I'm part of, called Canada-Palestine Support Network, we have as our logo a drawing by a famous Palestinian artist who was assassinated in the city of London, Naji Ali. And Naji Ali created a character which was a child figure. And he said we would view the child from behind until such time as Palestinian refugees were able to return to their homeland, in which case then he would draw the child figure with their face, and you would be able to see them face to face. Now this drawing of Naji Ali has the child from behind, and in front of the child is barbed wire, obviously a sign of denial of rights, obviously a symbol of difficulty and pain. But one of the barbs on the wire has blossomed into a sheaf of wheat, a grain of wheat. And so what Naji Ali presented to us was the tension between the pain, the suffering on one side, and the hopefulness on the other. And I think we have to keep that in our mind as we look at any issue related to Palestine. So what is BDS for short? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's a tactic. It's not an end in itself. It's a tactic that could be used for various ends. People might use it to try and bring about the end of the occupation. Or people might use it to try and say, we will apply this tactic until such time as Israel complies with international law and human rights principles that have been enshrined in United Nations charters, a much broader goal. So it's not a goal, it's simply a tactic, a method. The second thing is that it is noticeably and importantly a nonviolent tactic. It's a tactic designed to isolate Israel from the community of nations until the required changes have been implemented. And those could be depending on what your goal is. Now, BDS, or boycott, divestment, sanctions. Boycott means, very simply, that you refuse to purchase things that originate in a particular country or place. Divestment means that if you are a church organization, for example, that has various funds, and those funds are invested in different corporations, that you might choose to remove those investments from corporations which are involved in promoting or supporting Israeli settlements. Sanctions are usually actions taken by state governments to state, which say we won't have relations with a particular country. So in the case of South Africa, people didn't purchase South African oranges or drink South African wines. Municipalities took the investments that were in corporations which had business in South Africa. They said, we'll withdraw those investments from such corporations until South Africa gets rid of its apartheid system. And various governments at different times, under the pressure of their own populations, decided that they would, at least formally, not trade with Israel, not trade with South Africa, or they would boycott sales of various things to South Africa, or not have South Africa as a member of the United Nations, and so forth. Now, BDS has moral credibility only if you can demonstrate a claim that the country against whom you are trying to develop a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign has behaved and continues to behave in reprehensible and criminal ways, and moreover is dismissive of reasoned criticism and moral appeals intended to convince them to change their ways. So it's if someone is a serial criminal, I would say, in a metaphor. Then if you can demonstrate that, a campaign of boycott and divestment and sanctions has moral credibility. If you cannot demonstrate that, then people have a legitimate basis for saying one should try to reason, make moral appeals, engage in dialogue with the person or country whose behavior you disapprove of, because they haven't yet shown themselves to be so engaged in criminal behavior. And criminal, I mean by violations of international law, war crimes and so forth, or so insensitive to reasoned appeals that this is justified to try and boycott, divest, or sanction that country. And BDS also, the credibility of it depends, in my view, on the main victims of the actions of the state that is being boycotted or divested or sanctioned, that the main victims of that have called for and wish us as people outside that boundary to engage in such actions. So in this case, if the Palestinian people did not call for boycott, divestment, and sanction, I do not think it would be credible to initiate such a campaign. So with regard to this point, as you said at the beginning, the Palestinian victims of Israeli state policies first called for a BDS campaign just under 3 years ago, when some 171 grassroots popular organizations representing Palestinians in 3 ways. Palestinians inside what's called the State of Israel, that is inside the territories prior to 1967. Palestinians inside the occupied territories, which you know of as the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. And Palestinians who have been driven out from their homes and are refugees in territories, Syria, Lebanon, and other parts of the world. So the refugees, the people under occupation, and the people inside Israel who have Israeli citizenship, all represented in these various popular organizations at least, all called for a boycott campaign. Secondly, though it's hardly ever acknowledged in our media, academic discussion, and certainly not in government commentary, BDS is far from the only Palestinian form of nonviolent resistance. People often say to the Palestinian people from outside, "Why don't you use nonviolence?" Well, in fact, Palestinians have consistently used nonviolent resistance. In the first Intifada in 1989 through to the mid-90s, the Palestinian people as a whole were largely engaged in nonviolent resistance to the Israeli occupation. They refused the payment of taxes. They boycotted Israeli products in the occupied territories. They organized many grassroots efforts. And we today rarely, if ever, hear, I would ask you here, if I say the name of a town called Bilin, who is familiar with Bilin? Okay, 4 people. Bilin has been the site of ongoing nonviolent resistance to the construction of Israel's massive wall, whatever you want to call it, separation wall, Apartheid wall, or just damn big wall. This village has weekly had demonstrations to try and block the continued construction of this wall, which divides their land and them from their farmland, and is an effort to destroy the viability of their community. They have for several years now, on a weekly basis, conducted nonviolent civil disobedience in an effort to stop this construction. And the Israeli government has, in the last 2 weeks, I think, maybe 1 week, issued instructions to the Israeli military in the area to say they are now entitled to use lethal force. Lethal is deadly, kill people who are nonviolently protesting. So we should not think that BDS as a nonviolent campaign is a unique and first-time experiment for the Palestinian people. It is part of an ongoing and quite widespread resort to nonviolent resistance to the occupation. So I said, moral credibility of BDS depends on certain demonstration that the Israeli state and its pre-state institutions, that's prior to the declaration of the Israeli state in 1948, have committed and today continue to commit such serious crimes that the isolation of Israel is morally appropriate. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian, specialist in the history of his own country, and quite an authority and path-breaking researcher in relation to the founding of the Israeli state. He recently toured Canada, and he spoke in Vancouver